Hey, number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we are back with Wired. Considering the fact we've had like some really bad experts and some really good experts, what are we gonna get today? A Wired expert or a weird expert? Let's see. Well, how about we check out the Medievalist professor answers medieval questions from Twitter, tech support, Wired. All right, let's go. What sort of topics do we have? So we're going to talk about medieval English. Oh, I love that one. Middle Ages, Red Wedding, sleep cycles, torture device, medieval castles. I think I need to make a phone call today. Jousting. Okay, I need to make a couple of phone calls. Excuse me. Hi, I would like to speak to the Lord of the Manor, please. Yeah, that's your boss. Yeah, Jason Kingsley. I wish I didn't have to state the obvious. All right, thank you, I guess. This guy. Hey Jason, yeah, it's Metatron, how you doing? No, I just wanted to let you know that I found a medievalist, but enough about that, never mind. Let's talk about your squire for a minute. Yeah, honestly, not really very bright. I don't want to speak out of line, but I don't know, I think you should do something about this. You should get rid of him. You should get rid of him. Oh no, I don't mean he should be fired. I don't want you to fire him. I mean, I'm not a savage. Plus, there will be a waste of gunpowder and saltpeter. No, I was thinking more like a hanging or a beheading. People love a show. Appreciate that. Thank you so much. I'm glad that we were on the same page.
I'm Medievalist Professor Dorsey Armstrong. Let's take some questions from the internet. This is Medieval Support.
Pleased to meet you. Maybe.
At Johnny V4538570 asks, what did medieval English sound like? A good shorthand way to figure out what medieval English sounds like is to take all vowels and pronounce them as you would in French and pronounce every letter. The word for wife would be pronounced weef. The word for house would be pronounced huus. The word knight, knicht.
Okay, there's a bit to unpack here, but so far she seems good. I just wanted to say a couple of things here. Now, clearly she's referring to the great vowel shift that occurred between the 1400s and the 1700s within the English language. So, of course, the way vowels were pronounced, she's absolutely correct, it was a lot closer to the way they are written than the way they are pronounced in English today. Long vowels moved upwards and high vowels became diphthongs. That's pretty much what happened here. That's why you say I, wife. That's a diphthong because you have I, but originally, as she's saying, would have been pronounced weef. With that being said, I'm not sure if I agree with the idea of, just pronounce it like French would, but pronounce every letter. First, she's not pronouncing every letter because pronouncing every letter would mean weefe. You would have to literally pronounce every letter. Huse, which of course you don't do, the final one is still not pronounced. Knicht, I know it sounds so strange, isn't it, when you really hear it that way. But once again, the way she read it, to me, sounds closer to German than it does to French.
Here is what the Lord's Prayer would have sounded like in Middle English, probably sometime in the 14th century. Our Father that art in heavenes, hallowed be thy name. Thy realm or kingdom come to be, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Caffeinated Days asks, why was it called the Middle Ages? How did they know when the end was?
Yeah.
The name Middle Ages was given to that period by people who came much later.
Of course.
And the middle that they were thinking of was the period roughly from about 500 to 1500, after the fall of the Roman Empire and before the Renaissance. Around 1000, there is an increase in population, and so we call this period in between, say about 1000 and 1300, the High Middle Ages. This is when the university system comes into existence.
Yes.
This is when those beautiful cathedrals are all being built. It really is a golden age in the medieval period.
That's a wonderful answer. So far, so good. You know what's interesting about this that I would like to add to what the professor correctly stated is, of course, people in the Middle Ages wouldn't consider themselves to be medieval. It might sound obvious, but it really isn't, is it? Like, oftentimes we think the Romans considered themselves Roman, but of course they didn't call themselves classical or classical antiquity, and the same for medieval people. But with medieval people is even more so because they weren't medieval from their perspective. So how did they call their times? And the answer is the present.
Before We Kiss asks, wait, The Game of Thrones Red Wedding really happened? It's well known that George R.R. Martin borrowed liberally from medieval history.
War of the Roses.
The Red Wedding itself is based on Scottish history. In 1440, the young king of Scotland invited the young leaders of the Douglas clan to dine with him. When you're invited into the feast hall, you dine with the king. The code of hospitality should maintain that no ill can come to you. And instead, they were betrayed and beheaded. Like in Game of Thrones, much of the contest over the throne has to do with rival factions that maybe to some degree or another are related to one another. George R.R. Martin took as his template for this the late medieval conflict known as the Wars of the Roses.
Yeah.
You have the Lancaster cousins against the York cousins. And in the show, the Lannisters have a name that sounds very much like Lancaster, and the Starks with their one-syllable name. That name chimes nicely with York. As far as characters go, the Mad Targaryen king would seem to be a pretty clear analog to King Henry VI, who suffered bouts of madness. Cersei Lannister very much resembles Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's queen. Her son was probably not the son of Henry VI. Henry VI himself commented that he could not remember when the conception had happened and that it must have been a miracle. This, of course, seems to be very much like the situation with Cersei, whose children are not that of Robert Baratheon, but are indeed the children of herself and her twin brother, Jaime Lannister.
Isn't that fascinating when you have an academic or a professor who's also familiar with something that belongs, of course, to a completely different realm, whether it be pop culture, whether it be movies, whether it be novels, of course, it's the case. I very much like that. I would love to see this professor, for example, review the works of Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and see what sort of perspectives she would bring to the table. That's something I really, really enjoy. And so far, she's done an excellent job at doing that. When I was watching, or should I say, when I got really into Game of Thrones, I couldn't help but notice the similarities with War of the Roses. In fact, if you've never watched Game of Thrones, it might be a good idea to sort of prepare yourself by first watch War of the Roses, documentaries, and maybe read a couple of things here and there to have an overall understanding what happened, and then you'll very much enjoy it. I guarantee you'll very much enjoy doing what she just did now, but perhaps even at a higher or deeper level as you watch it. And to that, I want to add, I wonder if the Lancaster would be Lannister, and then you have York, like you expect, king at the north, if you will. What about the wall then? Maybe the wall could be, maybe he got inspired by the wall of Adrian's wall in the north that the Romans built. So in other words, those invasions that happen in winter, they would be what, Scottish people? I mean, when the Scots get mad, I'd build a massive wall to prevent that. So checks out.
At Solis Comrade asks, do I have narcolepsy or do I just have the natural sleep cycle of a medieval peasant? Sleep in the Middle Ages was very different from sleep today. People in the Middle Ages generally slept biphasically, which means in 2 stages. So there was what was called the first sleep. If you're in a natural sleep rhythm that does not have any exposure to unnatural light, you will fall asleep when the sun goes down. You will sleep for a few hours, and then you might get up, maybe around 11, midnight. You might do some chores. You might have sex. You might visit your neighbors. In early castles, the lord and lady usually slept in the great hall behind where they would sit at table for great feasts. All of the king's retainers and loyal warriors would also sleep in that same room. There might be a screen separating their sleeping quarters from the rest of the hall, but there was not a ton of privacy. Then usually around 2 a.m. or so, you might enter what's called the second sleep. And this sleep would go until the sun came up and you would arise and get ready to do your chores or your work for the day. It's not until the advent of electricity and people are able to work longer hours and they need to compress their sleep into one single block that we see people sleeping, say, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And that is not a natural cycle.
Yeah, honestly, it's fascinating to think how electricity has shaped and changed the way we live our life in a way that perhaps we don't really realize unless maybe you live in a farm. I guess if you were brought up in a farm, you still have access to electricity, of course. But I imagine your life cycle might be closer to what our ancestors in the medieval period would have had. Electricity is great, but then again, how much time do we spend in front of these screens? If I spend a lot of time in front of a screen all the way up to like a few minutes before going to sleep, I just can't fall asleep. On the other hand, if about half an hour before just turn off all screens and I read a book, I sleep so much better.
Rasus asks, honestly, why do medieval people have so many torture devices? What the was wrong with those people? First of all, they did not have all those torture devices.
A lot is
yes,
after.
They had some, but most torture devices you see came into use or were invented after the Middle Ages.
Correct.
Or they're completely fabricated, especially by people in the 19th century, who for some reason wanted to imagine the Middle Ages as a time of savagery. By contrast, they seemed much more civilized. So for example, you might have the rack, that might be legit. There is no Iron Maiden. There is no Spanish tickler. There were no chastity belts. Any chastity belt you have seen in a museum is a fake. At Medieval Scholar asks, what is your favorite medieval castle? This is a tough question to answer because I have about 20.
I understand.
Top of my list is Windsor Castle.
Windsor?
It is a great example of a Motte and Bailey castle.
Good
Basically,
choice.
a Motte and Bailey castle has two parts. First, there would be an earthen mound. On top of that,
This is actually one of my favorite images on the internet, because when you write medieval castle, you will get this. Is there something about the pastel nature of it? Like, it looks like it could be drawn by a really talented kid, if you know what I mean? And I love that about this. And I'm sure it was drawn by a professional. I'm not trying to insult anyone. I mean this as a compliment. It looks like one of those maps that you would draw if you're a DM during a D&D session to tell the players, all right, so here is the Lord, and that's where you're going to get the Duke, whatever the Count is giving you your mission. This is the inn where you can go get beverages and buy your rations for traveling. This is the armory, and this one here is the apothecary in case you need to get some healing herbs and that sort of stuff. Like, I love it. I love it. I'm going to have to print it and pin it on the wall.
That you would build a keep. Below and in front of the keep would be the Bailey section. And this is where all the activity of the household would happen. A Motte and Bailey castle also have another layer outside that enclosure, which would be a moat. If you are a knight in armor, the last thing you probably want to do is swim across the moat. The moat also prevents the enemy from tunneling under the castle walls to get to the keep. If the enemy forces push through the Bailey, then everyone retreats into the keep. For the most part, a castle was defensive. It was not luxurious.
Phone call number 2. Phone call number 2. Hey, Shad. Yeah, what's wrong? You were sleeping? Oh, goodness gracious. What time is it in Australia? Oh, why the heck do you live in Australia anyways? Isn't it like full of spiders and spiders? Honestly, mate, Spider-Man should be based in Queens. Should be set in Queensland.
There are, for example...
Yeah, no, she's absolutely correct. And I like the fact that people were so ingenious in the past. This happened in Europe, as she's saying. Let me give her a better, there you go. It happens in Japan. It happens in all sorts of different countries. But the idea of utilizing part of the natural environment to increase the defensive capabilities of your fortifications and at the end of the day, the residence of the Lord is to me spectacular. It really speaks to how ingenious the engineers were, and in general, anyone who was putting together all the effort needed to build a castle. When she's saying that a castle didn't necessarily need to be luxurious, that of course depends. I'm not correcting the professor in this because of course she's specifically talking about this one in particular, but in general castles were absolutely a way to show off your wealth as well. And what's funny is that castles weren't only used by nobles to protect themselves from invaders, but also to protect themselves from inward political instability and intrigue. Because at the end of the day, if you do something and you upset either a local but very powerful a duke or count, so a fellow nobleman, but they have the support of the church or they have the support of the high echelons of society, maybe he's an ally to the king and they want to murder you, well, you want to make it as difficult as possible. And so a castle is supposed to protect the Lord, we all understand that, but not always from the actual enemies, not always from the other countries, not always from the invaders, but sometimes from your king.
No hallways in castles. Hallways come about with the advent of the palace, which is post-medieval. And because of this, there's really no privacy. At At Shark3143 asks, did medieval kings ever just piss in the moat or what? Absolutely, and it's not just kings. Toilets tended to be a very, very small sort of closet that jutted out over the edge of the walls. Sometimes over the moat, sometimes just down into a courtyard, and some poor guy had to clean it up. These were also called garderobes. Garderobes means in French, a place to keep your robe. And if you hung your clothes in the garderobe next to all the ammonia scent from the urine, you were less likely to get mites and other creepy crawlies in your clothes.
Yeah, interesting. And also one thing I'd like to say about that is the idea what she mentioned, the fact that, oh, some poor lad was going to have to clean up all of the feces and, not only from the castle, but in general in the city. Yeah, that's a job. And I have a dedicated video to the craziest medieval jobs where I also speak about that and about some incidents that are documented about the fact that this job sometimes could be a little dangerous, shall we say. We have a record of one of these cleaning men who actually fell and drowned in the excrement. Oh gosh. Well, if you want to know all about that, link in the description. Maybe after dinner.
Wheezy814 says, could y'all imagine the swamp-ass people had during the medieval times? Yes, in the Middle Ages, you absolutely were smelling your neighbors much more than you are today. But it is a myth that they were completely unsanitary. Plenty of medieval cities had bathhouses where a caller would go through the streets announcing when the water was hot. In certain medieval communities like Strasbourg, if you were a civil servant, part of your salary went towards being able to use the bathhouse once a week so you could get clean. It did smell bad, there were open sewers, but it was not as bad as some people might believe.
Yeah, and also, bathhouses were quite popular. They were they were numerous. And of course, if you didn't live near a bathhouse or you couldn't afford a bathhouse, there is always the option to go to a local river or to a lake or maybe even the sea if you live close to the sea and you can still wash yourself. And that's what people did. They did do it. So, the idea that everything was unsanitary, it really compared to today, sure.
At Caveman Paints asks, how did humanity survive the Black Death without vaccines?
Yeah.
They did not. Most of them died.
Yeah.
If we look at the mortality rate for the Black Death, we see that it's something like 80%. And that means if you contracted plague, you had maybe an 18 to 20% chance of surviving. Otherwise, you were dead. The first big wave, which was about 1346 to 1353, wipes out half of the population, we now estimate. The population didn't have any chance to rebound because plague kept coming back over and over again up until 1721. And by the way, if you have seen images that supposedly represent what plague doctors looked like in sort of a primitive hazmat suit, no one wore those plague masks in the Middle Ages. You should know that that is anachronistic, it is wrong. That probably came into being sometime around the 17th century. I love your...
Very interesting. I didn't know about the mask being incorrect. I'll have to double check that, but if it checks out, then fantastic. I learned something. It's always nice to have stuff debunked, right? Because that's what... So I'll double check that, and if it's true, then I'll present it on one of my own debunking videos, but I have to double check. And that's actually another thing that I want to take an opportunity to share with you today when it comes to methodology of research. Just because she said it, it doesn't mean that now I go and repeat it. Right? I have to do my own research to double check it. Now, there is a high likelihood, since so far she seems so well prepared, that this will be true and it will check out. And in fact, if she is right, it's going to be very simple to double check this. I'll just find a few papers on it and then consult a couple of experts. And if it checks out, it checks out. But it can happen sometimes that someone says something, and because they say it confidently or because they have a degree, then you just take it at face value and repeat it, and someone else repeats it. And that's how myths are born. So it's very important, and do that with me too. We do double check as much as we can. So we really, really try not to spread any sort of misinformation on this platform. But yeah, Yersinia pestis bacterium. Terrifying.
Mom 3 says, Hansel and Gretel is brutal. Did parents even love their children? Infant mortality was so high in the Middle Ages that you might think there's no way medieval parents could attach any affection to children who were very likely to die. Evidence now shows that medieval people seem to have loved their children just as much as modern people do.
I don't think you need research for that, Professor. No disrespect, but yes, humans love their babies. Animals love their babies, and most cases. Just because your newborn child dies when they're very, very young, it doesn't mean that that's not going to wreck a family. It's just a matter of logic in that case. You don't need any research to understand that. Always horrible to think about it, but I've had a good friend of mine, and they lost him and his wife. They lost their first child, basically born with a defective heart condition, and the child didn't survive the birth, and it was devastating for them. Devastating. So even if you lose a child and they're 2 months old, or if you lose a child at 7 months, of course it's going to be devastating. And in fact, the question that the person asked, there was so much infant mortality, did they even love their children? And if that question comes from a place of ignorance, which sometimes is the case, sometimes it's from a place of curiosity, place of interest, sometimes it's from a place of ignorance, it's okay. It's okay to be wrong, and it's okay to be patient and tell them how things are. But in this case, it doesn't feel like a question, it feels like a statement. And that's why I'm saying it's a bit disrespectful. It's not a question, is it? It's a statement.
That they mourned when they died, that they worried over them when they were sick. Infant mortality rates before the first year of life are somewhere around 80%.
Yeah.
But if you made it past age 5, there's no reason why you couldn't live into your 60s, even 70s, and in some cases, 80s.
I appreciate that. So she's doing what another expert didn't do, although I don't remember now if it was Wired, if it was History Hit, whatever it was. Oftentimes when this topic of infant mortality, or in general mortality in the medieval period, mortality in the classical period is brought forth, people look at the percentages and they say, no, people died by the age of 32, most people. So if you were born in Rome, or if you were born in the medieval period, you'd be lucky if you're 32, mate. It's false, because it's all a matter of averages. People don't understand averages, and infant mortality is that's what's making it that the average now is 32. But as she's correctly explaining, as long as you survive as a child, then you'll have a very high likelihood to get to your 70s. Now, I don't know if she's going to say this, but another very important factor is nutrition and overall wealth. So children born in noble families, or children born in upper society, even upper middle class, had a much higher chance to live, whereas children that were born like in the low classes, so the low born, instead, unfortunately, had a much higher rate of death in infant mortality for obvious reasons.
The rate of infant mortality skews lifespan averages in the Middle Ages,
yes,
so that it looks like totally healthy people are walking around at age 35, they keel over and die.
She's great.
That's not the case. Since you mentioned Hansel and Gretel, this story and other stories like Red Riding Hood have one purpose: to teach your children not to go into the woods. Dangers in the woods include, for example, wolves. That was a very large danger. On the continent and in England, you also have all kinds of outlaws living in the woods.
Okay, so any video game and role-playing game is correct. You'll run, it's medieval, you run into wolves in the woods. Fantastic.
They made their living by thievery, looting, and all kinds of other unsavory practices. At Strongbow Beleg asks, I must ask, did medieval artists actually know what animals look like?
It depends on the animal.
This image is from the Aberdeen Bestiary. These are cats. Yes, indeed, they did know what cats looked like. We know that they had cats, and that cats were acting then like cats do now, because we have evidence of paw prints walking across medieval manuscripts. We do have a medieval manuscript in which a cat apparently peed on the page, and the monk circled it and noted which cat had done this to the manuscript. The way things were drawn or rendered was not meant to be a realistic representation. It was meant to be symbolic, flat, 2D, and often would have lots of signals or clues that had hidden meanings, especially in manuscript illuminations. And if you're going for a three-dimensional realistic portrayal, that's not quite as easy to do.
Yeah, and of course it depends on the animal, as I was saying, since she didn't expand on that. There were some animals that they didn't have a clue what they looked like, because they heard of these animals, but there are no pictures in circulation, there is no internet, they can't Google it, and so basically they are recreating by descriptions that oftentimes are just a written report, or maybe someone told you about it. So when they are like trying to draw a tiger sometimes, or when they're trying to draw some elephants, or they're trying to draw some animals that they're not as familiar with, as it can look really, really strange. It can look really, really strange. And in that case, I don't think it's a matter of stylistic choice. I think it's just that they hadn't got a clue.
Agna Ponks asks, how boring would it have been to be born in medieval times? What the hell did they do for fun?
No, actually, she's gonna dismantle this, I think, because it's different. It's different. Of course, you don't have video games, which for me would be terrible. But then again, think about it. Think about this for a moment. What do we do, at least me, but a lot of us, what do we do in video games? We play in the Middle Ages. I know. It's just a video game. Times were harsh. I get it. Still, go to the tavern, the adventure, the knight, jousting, learn how to sword fight. All of these things happened in the medieval period. So, yeah, I think that we have an idea what they did for fun, plus all the rest that she's going to teach us now.
They played all kinds of ball games that would involve kicking or hitting something like an inflated pig's bladder with a stick, lawn bowling, where they would roll smooth stones to knock someone else's ball out of the way. They also played board games. There's a game called Fox and Geese. That's sort of a strategy game. And they played chess.
I'll have to
Here
try it.
we have an example of a chess piece from the famous Isle of Lewis chess set, which was fashioned out of walrus ivory sometime in the 12th century.
Okay, let me see. I want to see the part about jousting, to be honest, 'cause I don't necessarily want to watch the whole thing, but this is really good. Let's check out jousting.
At Kenzie X Little asks,
Hey, Kenzie.
how the did jousting become a thing? Jousting started out as a very necessary, pragmatic
Training,
activity that was to train young knights for warfare.
Yeah.
Over time, however, jousting became something of a spectacle, and this eventually
Look at
developed
that.
into the full-fledged tournament, one of which we see in the beginning of House of the Dragon. The basics are there, two knights riding at each other on horseback with a very small barrier in between to keep them to either side of what are known as the lists. House of the Dragon has some of the lower classes there. This wouldn't have been the case in the Middle Ages. This was really something that the upper classes attended, and the lower classes might be present as food vendors or sellers of other goods outside the tournament arena, but not inside.
Okay, well, I have a few videos, but I've recently made one about the dangers of the joust, and I went quite deeply into that one and all the things that would happen, how dangerous it would be, and all the reports we read from the actual sources in the medieval period, so I'll leave a link in the description for that one too. Let's jump on to King Arthur. I like this one.
Nephley's Stuff asks, was there a real King Arthur? Maybe? In about 1191, the monks at Glastonbury Abbey claim that they have found the grave of King Arthur. The monks report that in the coffin they discovered there was a very large man who had died from an axe blow to the head, and they know it's Arthur's grave because on it is this leaden cross. And engraved on the cross in sort of very early script, here lies buried the renowned King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon. Now, in the 20th century, archaeologists excavated where the monks said they had dug, and they found out that indeed they had excavated someone. Whether or not it was actually King Arthur, we don't know. The cross itself has been lost. One clue that works in favor.
Yeah, of course it has. You have it. You stole it. Joking.
Of this is the spelling of Arthur's name, Arturius, which is a really early spelling. If you were gonna dummy up a cross to say you found the grave of Arthur in the 12th century, you'd probably spell it Artus. Also, the shape of the letters seem to be earlier than 12th century, although again, that could be part of the forgery. At Xavier Torch asks, did medieval knights name their swords? Because that's big in fiction. In the medieval tradition, the most famous sword is Excalibur, which belongs to King Arthur. Other medieval individuals who had actual named swords include Charlemagne, who had Joyeuse, his nephew Roland, Durandal. Some of these would be passed from generation to generation.
Love it.
And that's one reason why they would have names. Physical objects, such as the sword, would help to identify that person as the new head of the household.
Really like this presentation. This was a great video. Let's check out medieval women and we'll stop it there. Oops.
I'm medievalist Professor Dorsey Armstrong. Middle Ages. Oh, here's a good one. Who is your favorite influential woman in history? I have several favorite medieval women. Right at the top, though, has got to be Eleanor of Aquitaine, who famously was married to both the French king,
Look at that blue and red. I love the combination of blue and red. It's so medieval.
and the English king, and was mother to 2 more kings. Eleanor was the heiress of the huge Duchy of Aquitaine, which is in what today is southern France. She was married off to the French king. Overnight, that almost doubled the size of France. But the French king wasn't a great king. He would have made a great priest. Eleanor, coming from the south, which was the land of troubadours and chivalry and courtly love, and where women had much more power and influence, really was not having a great time up north in
Well, only noble women, let's be honest about it. Women in the medieval period did not have much power and influence unless you were a woman of nobility, regardless of whether you're in the north, south, east, or west.
Paris, where people were much more serious. She and the French king had 2 children, but after a certain point, it was clear that this was not working, and they got the Pope to annul their marriage. Once she was free, Eleanor wrote to the young Prince Henry, letting him know that she was available should he be interested. And he was. She marries Henry and had an additional 8 to 10 pregnancies. She is the mother of the famous Richard the Lionheart and the infamous King John. She was busy up until the very end of her life. She died when she was about 80 years old.
Yes, I mean, fascinating. Okay, so, Professor, thank you for your presentation. There were just a couple of things, really, that I had a few things to say. But in general, this was a good presentation, so I'm glad that we didn't get showered with stuff that isn't supposed to be presented in a historical presentation. And yeah, if you enjoyed this video, let me know. Please leave a like and a comment. And thank you very much for watching. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye. See you tomorrow.